On that Monday in late October, Blair, just 27 years old, but with a weariness that seemed decades old, walked down the hallway of her father's consulting firm, holding a now cold cup of coffee. The building was permeated with the smell of recycled air and accumulated stress, that heavy aroma that only exists in places where people work more than they live. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she wore a dark blue blazer she had worn so many times it had become a part of her skin. She was the woman who had turned down lucrative offers in Boston and New York to return to a dying company and rescue it from the abyss, never receiving a real thank you. That morning, however, something in her chest told her that the day wouldn't end like the others. Blair had spent 4 years acting as the invisible backbone of a business that, when she arrived, was nothing but debt, disorganized files, and empty promises. She had created processes from scratch, drafted contracts, attracted corporate clients, and convinced skeptical investors to back the consulting firm. Meanwhile, her father boasted at dinner parties that he had built the company through his own efforts. Wearing an expensive suit he bought with the money from the first contract Blair closed on her own. She wasn't looking for recognition, but she was looking for dignity. And that day, as she reviewed reports with surgical precision, she felt an inner tremor that foreshadowed an inevitable fracture. The fragile. A balance began to crumble when Emma, her younger sister, burst into the office with a never-ending bottle of designer coffee and a notebook full of absurd ideas. Emma walked as if she were on a stage, expecting everyone to applaud her mere existence. She had been appointed director without merit, experience, or even a basic understanding of what the company did. From day one, she had treated the employees like servants and Blair like a troublesome assistant, not the person responsible for keeping the place running. That morning, Emma walked in without knocking and announced that a client report had to be more colorful, shorter, and more fun, as if the corporate world operated like a school workshop. The employees no longer hid their exhaustion. Tom, a project manager for 15 years, left a meeting with tears welling up. Maria, the most meticulous accountant Blair had ever met, shut down her computer with a dangerous calmness. And Janet, the client relations manager, sent an early message saying she could no longer tolerate Emma's childish behavior. 3 resignations in a single day, 3 pillars holding up the structure. Blair walked down the corridor feeling each step sink something in her stomach, as if the entire building were tilting toward an inevitable end. She tried to contain the fire. She reorganized tasks, adjusted deadlines, and rewrote reports that Emma had ruined with pointless suggestions. But it was like fighting a storm that insisted on growing. The company already had cracks, but with Emma there, those cracks became chasms. Clients began to notice the mistakes, calling anxiously, asking if Blair was still in charge as before. She answered calmly, but inside she felt like an engineer trying to reinforce a bridge while others were ripping out the beams with a screwdriver. Mid-morning, Emma openly accused her of wanting to sabotage her leadership, a non-existent leadership that existed only in their father's imagination. The argument wasn't a shouting match. It was worse. It was an exchange filled with sarcasm, passive-aggressive remarks, and tense silences. Blair no longer felt anger, but profound sadness. How did a sister come to transform incompetence into victimhood? And if anyone reading this has made it this far, perhaps they can write from where they are reading this. Sometimes sharing these stories reminds us that we are not alone. That thought crossed her mind like a human reflection of vulnerability. The father, oblivious to reality but obsessed with protecting Emma's fragile image, summoned Blair to a meeting with the board, investors, and the accountant. The message read, 4 p.m., There are things we need to correct. Blair read it 3 times. She had a dark feeling that this wasn't a meeting to find solutions, but to find a scapegoat. And she already knew whose name would come out of her mouth. The boardroom was spacious, glass-walled, and as cold as an emotional operating room. Emma entered, her eyes slightly swollen, perhaps from strategic tears. Her father sat at the head of the table with that rigid posture he used to project authority, though his voice stuttered at the beginning of each sentence. The investors flipped through folders with uncomfortable expressions. No one understood why they were there, listening to matters that reeked of family drama disguised as operational issues. The father spoke for almost 40 minutes, distorting facts, taking phrases out of context, insinuating that Blair was too tough, too demanding, too cold. He didn't mention a single one of the nights Blair spent working until 3 in the morning to salvage contracts. He didn't mention the times Emma had ruined entire presentations. He didn't mention how he himself had benefited from every one of Blair's achievements. It was like watching a play written by someone who had deliberately chosen to forget the truth. And then came the sentence that marked a turning point. You can only return when you kneel and beg your sister for forgiveness. A heavy silence filled the room. Emma opened her eyes, surprised even by her own standards. Blair didn't feel shame. She felt clarity, an icy, lucid, devastating clarity. It was as if the universe had suddenly shown her the magnitude of her own sacrifice. That sentence, as absurd as it was cruel, was the final proof that she had spent 4 years offering loyalty to those who didn't know how to receive it. Blair stood up slowly, deliberately, as if each movement were a silent farewell to everything she had endured. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself, didn't justify anything. She calmly put away her documents, aware that no evidence would help those who had already decided to cast her as the villain in a story she herself had written with hard work and sacrifice. Her father watched her with a mixture of rigidity and bewilderment. Emma, with a pang of guilt that crossed her face for barely a second. Blair, without breaking down, simply understood that there was nothing left to salvage. She placed the resignation letter on the table, a plain white envelope, handwritten. Her father opened his mouth to say something, but Blair already had her back to him, refusing to let a single additional word enter her exhausted body. She crossed the boardroom like someone walking across a burning bridge, without looking back. Each step she took down the long, silent hallway seemed to loosen a different knot in her chest. When she stepped out into the parking lot, the cold wind hit her face, and for the first time in years, she breathed without pain, as if the air were hers again. The following days were a strange and necessary emptiness. Blair woke up without alarms, without urgent emails, without the constant feeling that the world would collapse if she didn't intervene. She drank coffee, gazing out the window, listened to the sounds of the street, and let the light into the apartment as if it were a new visitor. Her body, accustomed to constant shock, took time to understand that it was no longer being pursued by other people's expectations. And yet, in that newfound silence, something inside her began to rebuild itself. On the 3rd day, her phone began to ring insistently. Former clients wanted to consult with her. Former employees sought her advice. 2 direct competitors invited her to informal meetings. Among these messages, one stood out. Morrison Financial wanted to speak with her. That name sent a gentle jolt through her chest. It was a firm she deeply respected, a place where merit carried real weight. Blair replied with a "whenever you like," trying to sound calm, though inside she felt a spark she thought had been extinguished reigniting. When she entered Morrison Financial's headquarters for the interview, the glass building seemed to gleam with a clarity that contrasted sharply with the emotional opacity of her former job. The VP greeted her with a firm handshake and an interested gaze. He spoke of strategies, leadership, and vision. He didn't mention her family, the internal dramas, or the company's decline. He simply wanted to understand how she had managed to rescue a dying business and transform it into a solid consultancy in such a short time. Blair answered without exaggeration, with the honesty of someone who no longer needs to convince anyone. That same afternoon, she received a formal offer. A better salary, better resources, her own. Team, autonomy, and most importantly, respect. Blair felt the world opening up beneath her feet, not like a precipice, but like a wide, new path. She accepted without hesitation, and when she hung up the phone, she stared at the blank screen, feeling a warm thrill spread through her arms. After years of giving her all where she wasn't seen, she was finally in a place where her worth needed no explanation. The first few days at Morrison were a whirlwind of clarity. Projects moved smoothly. Meetings were structured, and colleagues recognized her abilities without her having to constantly prove them. It was a completely different environment, professional, direct, and without favoritism. For the first time, Blair worked without having to protect anything from anyone. Every analysis she submitted was received attentively. Every proposal taken seriously. It was like hearing her own name called without weight, without tension. One afternoon, after closing a complex deal, Blair returned home in a taxi, watching the city through the window. Lights twinkled between tall buildings, and the movement of the street seemed a reminder that life always goes on, even when we think we've fallen behind. She smiled discreetly, thinking about how far she had come since that dreary day in her father's boardroom. And well, if you've followed her this far, perhaps you could leave a comment or share this story. You never know who might benefit from reading something like this. That thought enveloped her in a newfound humanity, as if she wanted to embrace anyone who had ever felt burdened by more than they could bear. As Blair rose through the ranks, her father's company floundered like a ship that has lost its rudder. Without his organization and vision, mistakes multiplied. Clients began canceling contracts, frustrated by poorly written reports and hastily made decisions. The remaining employees worked as best they could, exhausted and directionless. Emma, facing reality. For the first time, without the filter of her ego, tried to hold on to what she could, but her lack of experience became evident at every turn. Her father continued to push her, failing to understand that he was reaping exactly what he had sown. One night, Emma called Blair, her voice breaking, without arrogance, without masks. She confessed that she couldn't handle it alone, that everything was falling apart, that clients were threatening to withdraw en masse. Blair listened silently with a mixture of compassion and restraint. She felt no desire for revenge, but neither could she go back to being the emotional safety net for those who had hurt her so deeply. She responded calmly, telling her that now she had to learn, grow, and face the consequences of her decisions. For the first time, Emma didn't argue. She simply took a deep breath, like someone who finally sees the true magnitude of the shadow she had been ignoring. Emma's tone shifted almost unconsciously in the following days. She began asking questions she would have previously considered an affront to her pride: how to prioritize projects, how to deal with difficult clients, how to manage a team without burning them out. She asked Blair for a list of books and courses, and that request alone was a huge gesture for someone who had always relied more on her last name than her own judgment. Blair sent them to her without lecturing or reprimanding her, like someone offering a rope and letting the other person decide whether to take it. To the surprise of many, Emma read. She took notes, underlined passages, asked for examples. For the first time in her adult life, she was making the effort to earn the position she had so desperately sought. Within the company, that change began to be noticeable. Emma stopped speaking ill of people over minor details, stopped promising impossible deadlines just to save face, and started saying, "I don't know," when she didn't understand something. What would have previously seemed like a weakness became the foundation of her credibility. Employees began to approach her again, cautiously, testing whether this more humble version of Emma was real or just another temporary phase. She listened, took complaints seriously, and admitted when she had made a mistake. She didn't become perfect overnight, but she did become more human, and in a weary environment, that was a relief. The father watched everything from an uneasy vantage point, like someone who realizes too late that he's bet on the wrong horse. He had risked everything to protect an idealized image of his youngest daughter, failing to understand that overprotection can also be a form of neglect. Seeing Emma truly striving, reading reports, staying late for something other than mere whim, stirred something within him. At the same time, every small achievement of Emma's reminded him, like a silent slap, of how he had disregarded years of Blair's consistent effort. It was a mixture of pride and guilt he didn't know how to handle. Meanwhile, Blair continued to rise through the ranks at Morrison Financial with a natural ease that would have been impossible in the family business. Her presentations were clear, her strategies worked, and her results were evident in the numbers, not just in speeches. Her colleagues sought her out for advice, not to vent their frustrations about a broken system. Executives trusted her with sensitive decisions, and her name began appearing in connection with increasingly larger projects. Without realizing it, Blair was becoming the kind of figure her father always claimed to be, but without the need for embellishment or exaggeration. One ordinary day, amidst that intense but healthy routine, Blair received a document with a list of companies considered for a possible strategic alliance. She reviewed the names carefully, analyzing strengths, weaknesses, and growth potential. And there it was, the logo of her father's consulting firm. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. She felt neither anger nor pleasure, only a strange sense of a circle closing. It was clear that someone on her team had identified potential in the company, probably thanks to Emma's recent efforts to bring order to the chaos. Blair rested her elbows on the desk and took a deep breath, aware that the past and present had just converged in a single file. Instead of reacting from a place of hurt, she decided to see it for what it was, an opportunity to objectively evaluate a place she knew all too well. She analyzed the cold, hard data without letting memory distort the numbers. She saw process improvements, some customer recoveries, clear signs that someone had done the homework they had previously refused to do. She also detected structural weaknesses, things she had pointed out years before that were still there, waiting for the right moment to collapse. She prepared a preliminary report and presented it at the committee meeting without mentioning that it was her family's company. She wanted to ensure that the decision was made on merit, not on family name. The formal meeting between Morrison Financial and the consulting firm was scheduled for a few weeks later. When Emma received the email invitation, she felt a knot in her stomach, not only because it was an opportunity that could save the company, but because she knew who would be sitting across the table. Upon hearing this, her father remained silent longer than usual. He didn't make any jokes, didn't talk about handling the situation. He simply nodded, like someone finally admitting he was out of control. They both knew they couldn't enter that room as a family, but as representatives of a company that needed to prove it, deserved this partnership. On the day of the meeting, Blair arrived first. He wore a sober suit, carried an organized briefcase, and exuded the composure of someone who knows himself well. He greeted his own firm's team, arranged papers, and reviewed notes. When Emma and her father entered, there was a second of heavy, almost ceremonial silence. There were no hugs or forced smiles. They shook hands, as is customary in the corporate world, firmly, without many words. That gesture, simple yet enormously symbolic, made it clear that the rules of the game had changed forever. During the presentation, Emma clearly outlined the progress they had made in recent months. She didn't exaggerate, she didn't fudge the numbers, she didn't try to make herself seem bigger than she was. She spoke of mistakes, of lessons learned, of processes implemented thanks to external recommendations. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but then it steadied. Her father intervened little, aware that his speech was no longer the focus. Blair listened, took notes, and asked objective questions about projections, responsiveness, and internal structure. At no point did he bring up personal matters. For the rest of those present, this meeting was just another negotiation. For the three of them, it was a kind of silent emotional test. When it was over, Morrison's team withdrew to deliberate. They walked down the hall, discussing technical points, strengths and risks. Blair participated as always, contributing his analysis with the same precision as in any other case. In the end, the recommendation was clear. The consultancy deserved a limited opportunity, with strict conditions, but with growth potential. A pilot collaboration was approved. It was a decision based on data, not shared history, and although no one said it aloud, everyone felt that something much bigger than a simple business deal had been struck. Emma and her father returned to the room to receive the formal news. There were no exaggerated celebrations, only a quiet relief that seemed to lighten the air. Emma offered her thanks with a humility that would have been unthinkable months before. She spoke clearly, without embellishment, acknowledging that there was still much to improve. Her father, on the other hand, seemed small in his own suit, as if he had been carrying a weight for weeks that had finally broken him. Blair observed everything with unexpected serenity. He felt neither pride nor revenge, only a strange peace, as if simply being there without anger was a victory in itself. When the meeting ended, Emma approached Blair with slow, almost timid steps. She thanked her for handling the situation professionally and for not shutting them out, even after everything that had happened. Blair sensed an honest vulnerability in her eyes, the kind of fragility that doesn't seek to manipulate, but rather to show that real learning had taken place. They didn't hug, they didn't make dramatic promises. It was a short but profoundly human conversation, and in that brevity, it was clear that both of them had changed irreversibly. The father took longer to approach. His hands trembled slightly, perhaps from nerves, perhaps from years of decisions made. Out of pride, he didn't immediately say, "I'm sorry," but he did admit in a low voice that he had been unfair, that his need to protect Emma had blinded him to Blair's merit and sacrifice. She didn't respond forcefully or with reproaches. She simply told him that from that moment on, things had to be done with mutual respect. It was a simple exchange, without overwhelming emotions, but with enormous weight. The first time in her life that he truly saw her as an adult, not as an extension of a family duty. The following weeks passed with a newfound stability. Emma continued learning, relying on external mentors, and making decisions based on sound judgment that, at last, was beginning to take shape from a place of responsibility rather than mere whim. Her father reduced his operational involvement, understanding that leadership isn't sustained by shouting or favoritism, and the company, while far from perfect, began to function like a healthier organism, less dependent on the emotional. Chaos that had previously dominated every corner. Blair, meanwhile, continued to solidify her position at Morrison Financial. Her projects were progressing successfully, her name was beginning to circulate outside the firm, and, without intending to, she became an internal authority on strategy and resilience. What she had experienced no longer defined her, but neither did she deny it. It was part of a story she had embraced enough to understand it, but not so much as to become trapped by it. She had learned to occupy spaces without asking permission, to set boundaries without flinching, to not compromise her dignity to fit into broken dynamics. Over time, Blair bought a bright apartment, filled with plants that defied all odds, and adopted a stray dog that followed her everywhere, as if it had found a second chance in her. They walked together through the city, sometimes in the early hours of the morning, when everything was calm and the lights of the building seemed to flicker in, sync with her breathing. It was on one of those walks that Blair understood something important. Her life was no longer made of scars, but of choices. Sometimes on Sunday afternoons, she would visit her father and Emma. She didn't do it out of obligation, but because a part of her still valued the idea of family, even though that family hadn't been able to sustain it. The conversations were calmer now, filled with respectful silences and fewer unspoken expectations. Emma would recount her progress without exaggeration. Her father would listen attentively, avoiding falling into old patterns. Blair didn't try to fix anything, and that, paradoxically, kept everything more stable than it had ever been before. In Morrison, the months continued to bring achievements. Blair was invited to give lectures on strategic leadership and organizational rebuilding. Her story, that blend of loyalty, injustice, resignation and rebirth, resonated deeply with people who had experienced family or work. Environments that drained them of every last drop of energy. Blair spoke without bitterness, without drama, focusing on what she had learned, that sometimes loving your family isn't about saving it, but about ceasing to destroy yourself for it. One night, after closing her laptop following a tiring but fulfilling day, Blair gazed out the window at the city. The lights seemed to form makeshift constellations among the buildings, and the silence of the apartment enveloped her with an unexpected tenderness. She thought about the company she had saved, her sister who had grown up, her father who had woken up late, but at least he had woken up. She felt a profound calm, the kind that comes when you understand that nothing you lost was truly yours, and everything you gained was a consequence of choosing yourself. And so, in that gentle stillness, she knew that her story was neither a tragedy nor a perfect victory. It was a journey, a rebuilding, a silent reaffirmation that competence triumphs over favoritism, that dignity is worth more than any title, and that self-respect is non-negotiable. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and allowed that certainty to fill her completely. Her life, at last, was her own.